Welcome to Leadership Explored, the podcast where we explore what it really means to lead in today's world. I'm Ed Schaefer, joined by my co-host Andy Siegmund. In our last episode, we talked about the myth of the 10x contributor, the idea of the lone genius who does 10 times the work or creates 10 times the value. And we asked a pretty simple question: does that actually help a team succeed? Today, we're taking the next step, because if 10x impact doesn't come from one person doing hero work, then where does it come from? This episode is about assists, about the glue people on your team, the ones who don't always get the headlines or attention, but hold everything together. They connect the dots, elevate others, and they make the whole team better. They're not flashy, but they're invaluable, and too often we miss them entirely, until they're gone. We're so quick to reward the star performers, the visible output, the big wins, but what about the people who make those wins possible? What about the person who sets others up and doesn't take the shot? Or the teammate who pulls others together behind the scenes? Whether it's sports, software teams, or corporate culture, this episode is all about the under-recognized players who elevate everyone around them. So Andy, last time we talked about the myth of the 10x performer and the problems with always trying to hire A talent. So I'm curious what you've seen in your career. Have you worked with someone who made things happen for a team but never really got the spotlight? What kind of impact do you think they have on a team?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, Ed. And I think it's one of those maybe underexplored aspects of team composition, right? So I think when we're talking about building teams, whether it's a project team or yeah, you're a leader who's building out their headcount underneath, we think about the like core functional requirements, and we don't think as much about the types of personalities that we need or the way that we need to gel things together. And when we started talking about having this conversation, we were, I think, both talking about a colleague that we had who was a perfect example of a glue person here. And every high performing team I've been on, there's always somebody who's just like a little bit more under the radar, right? Maybe they're less outwardly ambitious, right, or less spotlight driven. Maybe yep, sometimes a little more on the introverted scale. There's various different attributes, but they tend to pick up a lot of the work that no one really wants to do. They do it happily, right? And when that person disappears, the whole team usually goes into the disarray, right? You kind of it's one of those things where like if you think about your team and you think about whose vacation has the biggest impact, I'd make a strong argument that it's probably not the most visible person on the team, right? It's not the person who's the loudest or who's you know the most active, try hard. There's usually somebody a little bit less just outwardly visible whose absence is like really really felt when they're out of the office. And Ed, I'm curious, obviously we have a shared experience with this, but outside of that acute one, have you seen this archetype come up multiple times in your career, and what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I mean, my own experience and the evidence definitely backs up the idea that 10x isn't about the star, it's about the assists. I've seen that lots of times on teams where it's like things aren't getting done or we don't seem to be making as much progress. And then all of a sudden, maybe you bring somebody new in and they're not the all star, but suddenly things are moving a lot smoother. Or, I mean, I think the bigger one is the when they take PTO or a layoff happens and you get rid of somebody who everybody thought like, oh, they weren't doing that much, but then all of a sudden everything slows down or grinds to a halt. I see that happen quite a lot. And I think it's interesting because the evidence and research that I have seen over the years definitely backs up this idea, I would say. I'm not a big sports guy, but there's a lot of interesting research showing that assists are one of the strongest predictors of team success in sports. There was a study out of BYU that looked at multiple NBA seasons and found that team assists had a significant correlation with win-loss records. It wasn't just the total points that mattered, it was how those points were scored. So teams that moved the ball more, created assists, and played together consistently outperformed teams that leaned on one or two scorers. And they even broke it down further. They looked at player position And I thought this was fascinating, even as a non basketball fan, was that small forwards, so not point guards and not centers, which I think are what most people would think would have the biggest impact on a basketball team, but small forwards did have the biggest impact when it on winning when it came to assists. Most small forwards are not well known or household names, but their performance has the most outsized impact on the outcomes for the team. So statistically, we might consider these middle of the road players, but they have more effect on whether teams win than the all stars and the popular players that everybody recognizes their name. And this shows up in other sports too. For using hockey, I know Andy, you're a big hockey guy, so you probably already know about this. But I thought this was fascinating. So Wayne Gretzky he's the well, I think somebody recently overtook him, but he was for a long time.
Ovechkin. Yeah.
Okay, so he was for a long time the all-time leader in goals, but he actually has more than double that number in assists. So I don't know about now with the new guy, but previously his assists alone would have made him the NHL's all-time points leader, just to show how critical it is to set other people up to score. And I don't think I've heard of anyone who is beating his assists record at this point.
It, it's functionally untouchable, realistically speaking. And I think what's also interesting about that, just to you know dig into the hockey analogy a little bit more, Ed, is hockey treats assists and goals the same on the score sheet, right? As far as the individual is concerned. So when you talk about a hockey player, like, yeah, there are some goal scorers, right? So Alexander Ovechkin, who just beat Wayne Gretzky's record, or Austin Matthews, who's probably the most talented up and coming goal scorer in the league right now. They'll usually highlight their goals and the goals that they score, especially if they're getting pretty high across the season, scoring more than 70 goals in the season. It's like a big landmark number across 82 games. But when they talk about players generally, and you talk about like player contracts, specifically forwards, they talk about points per game, right? They don't talk about goals per game. They talk about points per game, right? So if you're going to pay someone top scale money, they're going to be north of a point per game. They don't the general managers, now they know that they need to have somebody who can finish, right, and score goals, and somebody who can do set up assists, right? They call that puck distribution. But they cost the same, right? The goal scorer costs the same as the person who facilitates the goal scoring, because a lot of those metrics come down to points per game, and they're weighted the same. It's 1 point for a goal, it's 1 point for an assist.
See why we can't do that in more easily in our work lives.
In the corporate world, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we gotta figure out the talent of Al's score sheet in a much more nuanced way.
Yeah. Some of this research, I thought it actually got even more interesting. They found that teams that are overloaded with stars actually do worse. In the NBA, they found that teams with too many stars usually underperform. And over more than a decade of data, teams with 3 stars won more games than teams with 4 or 5. And the reason that they think this happens is because star-heavy teams tend to have fewer assists, they miss more shots, and they grab fewer rebounds. And it's probably because everybody wants to be the primary option, and ultimately it causes collaboration to break down. And researchers also found what's sometimes called the team player effect. And it's what we were talking about, how certain individuals systematically make teams better well beyond their own stats, simply by how they contribute to the team, whether that is making passes and assists, or whether it's just how they make the team feel safe and bring something to the team that nobody else is. And when we take that idea into the workplace, I think the parallels are pretty clear. There was a Stanford study that found that employees who work collaboratively stayed focused 64% longer, had more engagement and less fatigue than people who are working solo. The Institute for Corporate Productivity found that businesses that actively promote collaboration are 5 times more likely to be high performing. And there's data showing that up to 86% of workplace failures can be traced to lack of collaboration or poor communication, not a lack of technical skill. So based on that, whether it's sports or business, the pattern is the same. Assists win games. It's not just about the visible points or the outcomes or the goals. It's about the invisible work that makes those outcomes ultimately possible. So Andy, when you think about that, assists mattering more than the highlight reel shots, does that resonate with your experience? Have you seen a situation where the less visible contributor turned out to be a difference maker?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's almost, in my experience, almost universal that the difference maker is like is a less visible contributor. And I think that there is some nuance here, right? Because I think we started this off, right? I talked a little bit about team composition. And I don't think you can win without the star player, right? I think you need somebody who's going to go out, do the thing, right? Score the goal, take the shot, etc. But they can't win without the right support staff, right? Without and I think where I've seen things get really crummy is when you build a team, like when you have organizations who only want A players. You usually end up creating power struggles and fights, right? You need to have, in my opinion, various levels of ambition and competency and like different types of desires to work across your team in order to get everything done, right? Because usually the like most visible folks are going to gravitate towards the most visible work. And at least in my experience, oftentimes the less visible work they kind of get bored by. But if that doesn't get done, everything falls apart after enough time. And so I think it always just comes down to like what's the composition, what is the team good at and not good at, and where are those gaps that you need to fill. And I think that as a people leader too, if you're building a team for a specific function, you need to also understand like where you fit across these various archetypes and what it is that you're good at and what it is that you are not good at. So I shared this with you I think in a previous discussion, I once worked with an organization where a bunch of us ended up taking the DISC evaluation. And we realized that in one individual's organization, we all had the exact same DISC profile. So they were basically hiring for people who were like them, which was kind of fun because like we all sort of thought the same and operated and did things the same, but it didn't create a super high functioning team because where we were low on that was usually like attention to detail and those sorts of things, which became a huge gap after a while, right? So you had a bunch of people who really didn't like doing a certain type of work that was paramount to the work that we were doing. So we had over indexed on one skill set and under indexed on another skill set accidentally. And I think that that's like, it's really important when we're building those teams to understand like, yeah, you do want some people who want to go and take that leadership position, right? Want to go and be vocal and be seen and are motivated with that by that. But you probably also need that person who's going to show up, work hard, do the things nobody else wants to do, and do them without complaining, and then go home. When the clock strikes 5, they've got a foot out the door. Like that person's valuable to you too, as long as they're doing the work that's valuable to you. um, yeah, I think we don't think about those aspects quite as much as we should, and I'd like to change that.
Yeah. Yeah, I know we'll talk about that a little more later. So I guess let's help people let's unpack this idea of the glue person and help people understand who they are and what these traits are so that they can find them on their own team. So, in sports, we call it an assist. And in the workplace and with knowledge work, Andy, you and I, we like to call the person behind these assists the glue, sometimes the glue guy, the
Yeah.
glue gal. So it's the teammate who lowers friction, raises clarity, and quietly makes other people better. And I think it's important to acknowledge it's not a role or a job title. It's traits and behaviors that create an effect that you feel. Sometimes it can be hard to point to the specific things, but I think a lot of times you can really feel what it is that they're doing. Now I think it is important to mention that glue people are not the same thing as glue work. We sort of talked about the concept of glue work a little bit when we talked about how everything is the work. But
Mhm.
glue work is the coordination and translation that helps teams move, handoffs, documentation, context setting. All of that is real work, and it should be shared and recognized. A glue person might do some of this work, especially when there's a gap and it's not getting done otherwise. But that is not and should not be what defines them. A glue person is not just the person who's only doing that glue work or that work that nobody else wants to do. What really defines them is how they elevate others and shape the environment, so that kind of work is lighter, easier to do, clearer, and hopefully more fairly distributed. I think it's also really important to point out that being a glue person, is not martyrdom or gatekeeping. I think sometimes some people who might think that they're glue or fall into it, they want to take everything on. They take on all the thankless tasks. They work extra hours, and that can happen sometimes. Or they want to be involved in everything, and they want to make sure that they have a say or something like that. And it doesn't mean, being glue doesn't mean that progress has to route through any one person. Because if one person becomes the checkpoint for every decision, then that's not glue. That's just a bottleneck that slows everything down. But I do think some people, it's almost like you want to make yourself invaluable, or try to create some job security, and then you wind up burning yourself out, basically, by taking on everything, or you wind up slowing everybody else down, which wasn't your intention in the first place, but by being that bottleneck. So who are we talking about in practice? I think we all see a pattern with these types of people. They're the type of people who care more about the win than the credit. They translate across roles, so decisions travel with the why and not just what we're doing. They keep the temperature down in tough moments and follow through, so loops actually close. I think day to day, it shows up in small, useful moves. They make the intro that gets two teams unstuck. They send the follow up so no one's guessing what happened in a meeting. They start the deck so that people can react and build something together instead of just trying to start with a blank page. They ask questions like, do we need another meeting for this, or can we decide right now? Or surface the question that no one else is asking. They might draft a first pass of a run book so that the next incident isn't a fire drill with no documentation. None of these examples that I said are loud kind of work, but it's really steady, and I think it compounds and adds to the team. So, Andy, when you picture a glue person, are there any traits that show up for you first? And is there anything you'd add that I didn't mention, especially things that leaders should be watching out for?
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head with steady. Because while we're having this conversation, I've been thinking about the most constructive folks that I've worked with, right? Especially those who are like less outwardly visible or less like clamoring for attention or credit. And I just keep on coming back to that idea that they're steady, right? And I mean that in steady, like sustainable pace, outputs, outcomes steady, but also emotionally steady, right? And I think when we think about like the overall just social construct of our teams, making sure that there are a few folks who never get too high, never get too low, whose like kind of default setting is to be, again, steady, exudes competence, not clamoring for attention, is really, really critical, right? I've got somebody who works on my team right now who like wouldn't necessarily meet the definition of a glue person, but is a total glue person. He wouldn't meet the definition because he's got a rather senior title and leads a lot of our larger things. But his main attributes is he's super steady, he's super predictable, he's always in control, and he's not out there saying, how can I help you, how can I help you, how can I help you, but everyone is always like, he's the person everyone goes to for help, and he just like dispatches it swiftly and efficiently, doesn't look for praise. It's just like, oh yeah, this is how you do such and such, or this is how I go about such and such, and just kind of continues just working away. And like, it's been a huge asset to my team. I think the person we're thinking about that we worked with was similar, right? Never too high, never too low, just super duper consistent, competent, and able to just kind of move things forward slowly and steadily, and kind of keep chipping away at things, as long as they needed to go to be done.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking, I know the person we're thinking of was really great about that, where it was, if I needed to run something by them, or I wasn't sure how something should work out, I could get their take on it. And it was, it was always just kind of calm, and we can work through this together. And I always knew what to expect, I guess, when I would work with that person, because we could solve problems together. Basically, it was like they helped me, the areas that I wasn't as strong in, they helped shore it up, and then I helped shore up the areas maybe they weren't as strong in, and it ultimately made a better team that way.
Yeah, and super collaborative too. And that's something I really want to emphasize too, is like with these sorts of individuals, right? A lot of things are yes and that's sort of what we're looking for. It's not like necessarily an excited yes and of like, oh, let's like raise the temperature or like have a whole hoopla about this. It's just like, oh, interesting. Let's continue to unpack this. Have we thought about this? Have we thought about that? And it's not judgmental, it's generative. Um, and this is, I think, attributes that all of us could probably strive to do better with in our individual work and as leaders too, right? Remaining steady, thinking about cohesion, thinking about what gets us closer to the win, regardless of if it's like the type of work you want to be doing or the type of work that's going to be most visible. Yeah, just kind of being apolitical actors in that sense of like, this is what we need to do to move the ball forward. So let's go move the ball forward.
Yeah. Well, if assists matter this much, why do we miss them and the people making them? I think there's a few reasons. I think first, we pay more attention to what's visible and dramatic. I think that's just natural for us as humans, as unfortunate as that might be in some cases. So launches, demos, the crisis save, all of that stuff is easy to notice, and then it's also easy to celebrate. The work that prevents problems from happening in the first place is harder to see, if it's even, sometimes it's not even possible to see the work that went into preventing a problem from happening. If something doesn't blow up, it's tough to connect that lack of negative outcome to the person who helped set the conditions to make sure that thing didn't blow up in the end. So that's visibility bias and salience bias at work. What we see and what stands out is what gets the credit. We also have a tendency to remember what's recent and vivid. The last demo, the latest bug fix, the most recent escalation. Those are the moments that stick in our brains. Anything that was an earlier assist probably fades into the background. And this is the availability effect. So recent and memorable events dominate our memory. Then I think how we explain success contributes to this, because we love simple stories about individual talent, right? Like she crushed it or he's a natural. It's much harder to credit the setup, the context that someone shared, the pass they made, the conditions they created so the win could happen later on. And we have our tendency to judge ourselves on our intentions, and we judge others by what we can see. This is called the fundamental attribution error. So that can contribute to it as well. It's about our intentions, but everybody else, it's what we see happens. One impressive moment could color everything. This could be like the halo effect. They have one big visible win, and now all of a sudden they're the person you think of as successful all the time. And I think most of us, if we're being totally honest, we notice our own visible contributions more than our own assists, and definitely more than the assists we received. And this could be some sort of a self-serving bias where we're, focused on ourselves, and we may miss the assists that we receive because we're more focused on the contributions we're making. I would also say whose work gets seen as shaped by access and identity. People who are in the room, who are closer to the leadership, who are louder by style, or who fit our mental template of a leader are easier to recognize. People who are remote, people who might be quieter or more introverted, and folks who are doing coordination or emotional labor ultimately get less airtime, even when they're having a very real impact that makes a big difference. And then some work is invisible by nature. Relationship maintenance, translating between groups, heading off conflict, or keeping psychological safety intact. When that's all done well, nothing flashy happens, but it does have a really positive effect on outcomes. There's just not really an easy way to connect cause and effect in those cases. We retell the wrong stories a lot of the time. We celebrate really visible success stories, and we forget the quiet enablers or the near misses. That I feel like any organization I've joined or come into, you ultimately hear some story about the guy who stayed up all night to, do something and make sure something wasn't down, or, fixed some outage or whatever. And that's what everybody's celebrating, but they're not celebrating the person who came in every day and built resilient systems or anti-fragile systems that were able to bounce back, and you didn't even notice the outage happened. Well, sometimes those people get celebrated, but usually you don't notice that because you notice the outage and the hero stuff. Um, and ultimately that's survivorship bias. Only the obvious wins make it into the lore. And finally, I would say one of the other main things that happens that causes us to miss the glue and miss these people is we count what's easy to count. Most dashboards and review templates track outputs, what we shipped, what closed, what converted. This is information or measurement bias. It's Most people don't track passes. They don't track the introductions for unblocking work or clean handoffs or decision clarity. Um, I don't know how some people would track these things. It might be even tricky to track them. But if leaders don't choose to measure and reward that invisible work, then ultimately there's a chance it won't show up. And it could make it feel like fairness is drifting if certain people are taking on all of that assists and invisible work, and that can cause fairness perception problems and other challenges. And so I would say fundamentally, it's not that I don't think most leaders don't care about this glue work. It's possible some people haven't thought about it or haven't heard of it. But the people who do think about this, I don't think it's that they don't care. I think it's just that our attention and our natural biases and systems are set up to miss all of these things that actually make teams work and focus on the things that give the appearance of it working as opposed to what actually affects it. So Andy, does that align up with what you've seen? Did I miss anything, or do you see any of these happening more than others, or are any of these particularly problematic?
Yeah, I mean, as usual, I think you've really covered it, Ed. And I think like what that really highlights to me is as people leaders, right? It's super critical to do things like 360 reviews with your teams, right? And as coworkers and as leaders, I also think it's really critical to provide kudos for kudos is due, right? So when somebody gives you a hand or when somebody does something well, celebrate it and acknowledge it. And like not everyone wants the big thank you on Slack, especially if it's a smaller thing, right? Like be appropriate, but like if somebody does a great job, ping their boss and tell them that they did a great job. If they got you unstuck or they did something or they were just a delight to work with, ping their boss and let them know that this is somebody that you value and who's having, you know, who's uh who's really impactful, right? And I think it's one of those things too. There's this Simon Sinek talk where he talks about high competency and high trust, right? And he talks about how like in the Navy SEALs, right? Obviously, everyone wants somebody who's high competency, high trust, but they would prefer somebody who's low competency, high trust. He makes the caveat like these are the Navy SEALs we're talking about. Like the bar is pretty darn high, even for low competency, than somebody who's high competency, low trust. And he says like you can figure out who that high competency low trust is in any organization by just walking in and asking around like who's the asshole here, right? And I think the glue person is the exact opposite, right? It's the high trust person. The competency is usually relatively high, but it's sliding scale, right? We're talking about various different bars here. But it's like you can go around any group and like who do you who do you like to work with the most, or who is easiest to work with? And that's probably going to point out who the glue person is within your team, right? And they're not necessarily going to be the most visible or most outspoken person of the team, but there's probably, I bet if you surveyed your teams, you'd find that there'd be like near unanimous consent that there's one individual that just everyone on your team is like, oh yeah, I definitely, if you ask for like who the two people you want to work with the most on the team, you'd get unanimous consent on one of those two names, almost guaranteed,
Yeah.
if your team is performant. But put that caveat there. If it's not performant, all things are out the window.
Yeah, for sure. Well, so what happens when we miss or even worse, ignore the glue people in our organization or on our teams? First, I've seen this a lot. This has happened to me. You burn out your best people. I think we've all seen this happen to some extent. That one person who's always helpful slowly becomes the unofficial go-to for everything or all the uh, least pleasant work and most effortful, time consuming work gets dumped
No
on
good
their plate.
deeds go unpunished. Yeah.
Yeah. And then their day job, the work they're hired to do basically gets squeezed into nights and weekends because their days wind up filled with helping everyone else or being on a million meetings. And because that helping work is ultimately invisible on a spreadsheet or the tracker, it doesn't get rewarded. So they get tired, they just get disengaged, and eventually, most of the time, they leave to find a place that they feel valued and they feel like their contributions are meaningful and they're recognized. And when that happens, things just kind of get sluggish for everyone else. There's a little bit more friction. I mean, sometimes it's a lot more friction. It just depends on how much of a glue person they were and how much they were filling in gaps for other people. Um, so yeah, might be a little bit more friction, might be a lot more. You might have start having a lot more frustrating meetings where you have to revisit a decision because the why got lost in a handoff, or Teams chat channels start filling up with, hey, who owns this, or who can help with this, or who do I need to talk to get answers about this, or can someone give me context? Simple things just wind up taking more effort. And then underneath that, what can happen is over time, it starts to poison the culture. If only the big flashy wins are being celebrated, people are going to stop passing the ball because it's better for me to stay up till midnight, bringing the system back online than it is being a team player and giving everybody on the same page and making sure people are set up for success. So people get more protective of their own work, and that means that psychological safety starts to go down. And while it usually doesn't collapse overnight, it just kind of deteriorates and you start to feel the impact where people hesitate to ask for help or people aren't raising as many concerns as they were before because suddenly that behavior feels more risky and less like a contribution. And so ultimately, I think the long-term cost of missing, or I think it's even worse to ignore them if you're actively ignoring this capability. The long-term cost is massive. When a glue person leaves, you don't just lose their output, you lose all the unwritten rules, the social connections, history, understanding, knowledge, context, just all the things about how everything is really getting done. You might be able to replace that person with a role, just hire a new person to fill it, but you're not going to be able to easily replace that knowledge, that skill, and then most importantly, the trust, and also any context that they built. So that's my take, Andy. I might have missed some things from your perspective. Is there any other fallout you've seen when leaders drop the ball on this?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the key things to remember is that this archetype comes in many different shapes and sizes, right? So sometimes this is somebody who's doing less visible work or who's sometimes it's somebody who's connecting people across the organization, right? And that's the core skill set that they're bringing to the table. Sometimes it's the individual who really facilitates psychological safety because they're good at relationship building and they build relationships with each of the team members as individuals, right? Which helps us build cohesion that wouldn't be there if they're not there. And I think, in every organization, the role that that individual is playing is a little bit different. So the impact of the blast radius of their absence or their burnout is a little bit different. And I think it comes down to, thinking about who it is that everyone likes to work with and wants to work with, and thinking more deeply, why is it, right? Because it's probably not just because they're impactful or just because they get things done. It probably has a lot to do with how they get things done and how that allows enables your team or those smaller teams within your team to be greater than the sums of their parts,
Hmm.
right? And I think that's kind of what we're getting at, is there's always a few individuals who maximize the output of the team by the way that they go about how they do their work, right? And they allow 2 plus 2 to equal 5 instead of 4 because of the way that they go about it. And that's I think what we need to pay attention to. And that's the ball we need to try not to drop.
Yeah. When something I was thinking about with this is just how often I've heard from other people situations where it seems like they didn't notice the glue until it was gone. Like a layoff happens or something like that. And maybe at the team level, some people are going, oh, I don't know how we're going to keep going on as a team without this person. And it's not because they were the best developer on the team. It's because of all the other stuff that they enabled and made happen. So I'm curious, have you seen that play out? Like when a key person takes just a week of vacation, or even or something as severe as a layoff? Have you noticed what are some things you've noticed that start to break in those situations when it's a glue person who disappears?
Yeah, I mean, usually it's cohesion, or it's like if you're used to things being relatively quiet, when that person disappears, all of a sudden things are loud, right? So like I work in professional services and delivery, and when you lose that person, you go from no escalations to all of a sudden there are escalations coming from every corner, and you don't know why, right? And it's not escalations because things aren't getting done, right? It's not like the work came to a halt. It's escalations because there are communication mismatches, or there are just like a bunch of odds and ends that, I thought you were doing this, I thought you were doing this, and it turned out like, oh, it was that person who was just like managing that, and it wasn't on our radar, and now the floor fell out. And I see that time and time again. There's so much work that we measure and that we pay attention to, and there's so much that's subterranean. And when somebody who really excels at that subterranean work, leaves a group, it can be, sometimes it takes a little bit of time to happen, but it's usually like a pretty big fallout.
Yeah, it's almost like to like if we think about the kitchen and the stove, if you had a stove that you had to manually keep at a simmer, and otherwise it would
Yeah.
like tick up or tick down. It seems like they're the ones who keep turning that knob to make sure it's at a simmer, and they don't. And when they're gone, it either starts to boil over, or it's like the heat turns off and nothing's happening.
Right, exactly. Or yeah, I was thinking about it as like they're the person who keeps on putting the firewood in, right?
Yeah,
And there's a certain amount of time where nobody needs to be putting firewood in, but if everyone forgot, like it gets pretty darn cold, pretty darn quick, right? Like,
yeah.
but you don't know for several hours that that's going to happen.
So I'm really curious about your personal experience, Andy. Have you ever been the glue guy on a team? And if so, what was it actually like? Did you feel like that effort was appreciated, or did it feel like a thankless job that led to burnout? Or if you haven't been, have you seen anybody who maybe went through it?
Yeah. So I was thinking about this more deeply since we last talked about it, and I think it's a role that I've stepped into in various subsets, and like I find it can be really satisfying, right? So like one of the things I like to do is like I am the person usually who goes and tries to build relationships across the team, and I'm doing that in my current organization. And I found it to be wildly fulfilling because I'm getting insights into various parts of the organization just because I have open calls with everyone that are deliberately unstructured. It's like, tell me about what's going on in your sector of the business. Maybe we'll have problems that we need to solve together. And sometimes you play therapist, and sometimes you vent, and like, but I'm like in my current context, I'm catalyzing a lot of that. And it's funny because it's like where that sort of behavior I think also gets a little bit lost, and we talked about this before, is like it doesn't necessarily feel like it's the work, but it's definitely the work, right? Because it's a jumping off point, it's information gathering, it's sharing of information. It's just not necessarily in the most formal aspect. um so in that context, I think it can be really, really cool. And like that, I think is what I'm most intimately familiar with. Um, but I wish I could be the glue guy that our friend who started this conversation was, because he managed to both be the working person, like the person who like just had everything steady under control, seemed to do a lot of the like under the radar necessary stuff, but was also like had great relationships with everyone, while like sort of appearing outwardly as like not the most charismatic person in the room, right? But like everyone liked him. he knew everyone, he knew everything about everyone. He was like just always super linked in on everything that was going on, but like also 100% removed from any workplace drama 100% of the time, which was a really we should call him up and pick his brain and figure out how he operates and how he can be more like that.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you haven't had an experience, like a negative experience where you felt like the glue guy. Because I've had one of the reasons I did want to talk about this, aside from that it fit in with the other things we've spoken about lately, was um, I was at a job a while back where I was absolutely the glue guy, and I was doing a lot of the things we said you shouldn't be doing in that role, which like I was basically killing myself. I was working nights and weekends, doing all sorts of invisible work, and just trying to connect teams and make projects run smoothly because I wanted everyone else to succeed. And in that case, I thought everyone saw my contributions, and a lot of my team members would give me positive feedback and things like that. But I had a performance review that came around, and I was completely blindsided. It was the worst performance review I've ever had and have ever had since. And I mean, it really crushed me in a lot of ways. Like none of my coordination, none of the enabling work that I felt really proud of was even acknowledged. It was basically like half the work I was doing didn't even exist, as far as my boss was concerned, and it really crushed my motivation. I went from feeling essential to feeling completely ignored and undervalued. I'd actually already been on this path for a while, so this was kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back, and I feel like some resentment started to build up, and it was just like, man, I'm pouring everything I have into this team, but the system's not seeing it, let alone rewarding it. And that for me was a huge reason why I left that job. I was already on an exit path, but that was like the final straw, basically. That was like, okay, none of my contributions beyond the few things on the tracker or whatever are being acknowledged. So I did my best to leave good documentation and try to leave them in good shape, because that's what a glue person does, right? Even if you're
Mhm.
mad and feeling burned out and you're trying to leave, you still want to help and not cause people more pain. Um, and I heard from old colleagues after I left that a lot of things I used to handle just kind of started falling through the cracks. And I think I don't know who the lesson was for, but it sounded like there was a tough lesson that critical work and visible work aren't always the same thing. And also for me, I would say to some extent it was a lesson that going above and beyond and going the extra mile are not often, and I think sadly not usually, rewarded, and can often be taken advantage of. And I think it taught me some lessons too about boundaries and how to manage my own energy and time, and where to put my energy at work.
Yeah.
So we've established that
Uh,
glue people are critical and that ignoring them is incredibly risky. I think that leads to a big question for every listener, every leader who's listening right now. If they're so often invisible, how do you actually find them? And once you do, how do you make sure they feel valued so you don't lose them? And I think you've already touched on some of these things, but I guess let's start with identification. I would say I would say that this is good news because we're talking about it today, and I think it's just in a lot of cases, it's one of those things that once you know what you're looking for, you can start to see it everywhere. So just being aware of it and looking for it and paying attention, I think is probably the most powerful tool for finding these people. And you can find them by their behaviors, like we've talked about. A few of the common archetypes that I've seen is the connector. So look for people who, when you mention a problem, immediately says, "You know who you should talk to? Sarah from marketing. I'll introduce you." They're like a human router. They're always building bridges between people and departments, and they always seem to know where to go. Another archetype I've seen a lot is the translator, is what I would call it. This is the person who can sit between an engineering team and the sales team or the business team, and they make sure both sides understand each other. So they prevent the why from getting lost and make sure that the context is traveling with the information. Another one I've seen is a stabilizer. So this is somebody who, like in a tense meeting or a tense moment, they ask the clarifying question that lowers the temperature, or maybe they make the joke that kind of breaks the tension. They're the person who checks in on a quiet teammate or makes sure that a decision is actually clear before everyone leaves the room. And I think the stabilizer helps in a lot of ways for maintaining psychological safety. So yeah, and I think for organizations who want to get more systematic about it than just observing, you could use things like an organizational network analysis or an ONA. This is basically a data-driven way to map out who talks to who goes to whom for advice, and who connects otherwise disconnected groups. This could be a way to surface hidden influencers who don't show up on an org chart, but sometimes the lift is not worth the outcomes of something like this. Even doing an organizational network analysis, it can be hard to find some of this invisible work. So it may be a useful tool, but it's not necessarily gonna solve the problem. So how about you, Andy? If you're trying to spot the glue on a team, are there any other subtle signals that you've learned to watch for, or behaviors that tell you this is a glue person?
Yeah, and I think a lot of it comes to asking around too, right? I think especially if it's a team that you lead, or you're trying to figure out the various like values that your team brings to the table, or the individuals on your team brings to the table. Nothing's more critical than having conversations with the people they actually work with on a day-to-day basis, right? And trying to, and yeah, it's one thing to do like a probe 360 eval, and like, fill out a survey or write a thing about this, or have your team go and ask people to write their review. um it's another thing to just go and actually talk to those people, right? So like, I've been fortunate the way that most of my orgs are structured. I know who my team works with on a day-to-day basis because they're assigned to work with those people. But I think it's really critical to like go have those conversations, and get a deeper insight of what's happening day to day with the individuals on your team, and what value they're bringing to the table. And I think you'll be surprised at what you didn't know, and I mean that in a positive sense.
Yeah, no, that's great. So once you've identified these individuals, the next and arguably harder step is showing them that they're valued. And this is where I think a lot of organizations do fail. You can't just say you value collaboration, you have to build systems that prove it. So I think it probably boils down to three main actions: talk about it, measure it, and protect it. So talk about it is just about recognition. And this has to be specific and public. So don't just celebrate the person who scored the goal, celebrate the assist. And I know we talked in feedback when we were doing that podcast a while ago. It's not always about public recognition. So be aware of that. Some people would prefer not to have public feedback about them as an individual. But, if you have the option, you could, in a team meeting, say like, great work on that launch, Sarah, and a huge shout out to David, whose documentation made handoff to support seamless. That would be a way to capture those assists and recognize them as well. But the other way might be just to acknowledge, hey, we had this big win. We managed to get this thing over the line. I know a lot of people contributed to this in small ways that might not always be visible, and we want to just appreciate all the contributions. Maybe giving a shout out or something like that, or letting people give those shout outs and recognition can be a great way to do it. And I would say just by naming the enabling work, you start to make it visible and signal to people that it matters. And peer-to-peer recognition programs can be really fantastic for this because they empower the whole team to see and celebrate assists. Something I've done in the past, I haven't had as much success virtually as I did in person. But I had a big box of these kudo cards that were just a whole bunch of different cards with artwork and stuff on them, and like little positive sayings, and then space for you to fill something out. And I would have these at my desk, and if anybody had a kudos to give, they would grab one of the cards and they'd fill it out, and they could write a note to the person and who it was for. And then they would deliver it to that person, or sometimes they'd deliver it to me and then I'd present it to them. But we'd share it with them, and then we had a like a wall that we would put all of these kudos
Mm.
in. So that was a way I had done it at a team level. I also worked somewhere that they basically had a system for doing the same thing. So I worked with someone from another department. They could go in, I forget exactly what they called it, but they could basically submit a kudos, and it would email it to me and my boss. And that would give some amount of recognition. And whenever I received one of those, it felt good. But it didn't always go somewhere else with it. So finding the right balance of like, what are we acknowledging and what do we want to recognize? Because you can't always reward everything in a like a monetary way or something like that. But if we're just giving peer-to-peer recognition, and that doesn't ultimately help people in a bigger way, then it may not have the kind of impact that you're hoping for recognizing those glue people. Next up, you need to measure it. If collaboration isn't part of your performance review process, then it's just nice to have. You have to formally build enabling others or cross-team contribution into your review criteria. Does it impact someone's rating? Does it factor into promotions and compensation? When people see that making the team better directly contributes to their own career growth, then you can really start to shift the culture in a much more meaningful way. And then the third one I said is, and I think this is critical, is you have to protect it. The biggest risk for glue people is burnout. They become the default for a lot of questions and coordination tasks. So as a leader, our job is to run interference, to protect their time for their own core work, encourage them to delegate, and I think most importantly, make sure the glue work is seen as a shared responsibility, like we talked about in our It's All the Work. And make sure everyone understands it's all the work, and it shouldn't just be the burden of one helpful person or someone who's willing to take on that pain. So Andy, when you think about valuing the contributions through recognition, performance metrics, or support, where do you see leaders stumble the most? And have you ever seen anyone do it really right?
Yeah, I mean, so I love the idea of like the kudos cards. I've been to some organizations that have it digitally, and it's I feel like that's also one of those things that it can be well intended, but it's easy to weaponize or turn into a hooray me, hooray you sort of thing. Like I remember a similar context where when I was in music school, we did not like one of the conductors very much, and yeah, typically the honorific, right, as you call them, maestro. So we just called everyone maestro for a spell, and sometimes those kudos cards feel the same way, where it's like I give you kudos, you give me kudos, I give you kudos, you give me kudos, right? It becomes that sort of thing. So it can get a little bit disingenuous. Um, the org I work at right now has spot bonuses where you can nominate people for like a literal bonus, and they will give you cash. I think those mechanisms are really great. Um, I think also like as a leader, it just comes down to building relationships and getting an understanding of what people like and what people don't like and how they want to be recognized and how they don't want to be recognized, and trying your darndest to do that, right? Appreciate people, you know, yeah, typically the guidance is show appreciation publicly and criticism privately. I think it's worth adhering to that. I think it's also worth knowing that, like, if you've got people who are working on the sorts of work that they don't like to do, you can't keep them there just because they're excelling at that. You've got to give people opportunities to do other things, because if you don't, you're going to lose them, right? So trying to figure out like how to recognize, how to do things right, how to give people opportunities for growth. But on the flip side, there are also you're going to come across individuals who like the job that they're doing, like being under the radar, like being competent, and don't want to do anything else. So don't organize for up and out when you have competent people who want neither up nor out, right? It's okay to be a jobber, right? I think that's one of the things that, especially an audience who would be listening to a podcast about leadership might not as easily recognize. Is like not everyone has the same level of ambition that you have, and it's okay to not have that, right? It's if you are doing your job well, if you have somebody who's doing their job well, they may or may not be a glue person, but if you have somebody who's doing their job well, who's hitting their KPIs, just because they're doing the same thing year over year, if they're happy doing the same thing year over year, keep that person around. They're super useful, and they probably are obtaining a bunch of institutional knowledge that's also going to be super useful to you and to your team, and that is an asset, not a liability. And I think we often forget that.
Yeah. Yeah, and this loops us back around to something you'd started to bring up earlier, which is, I think, also a bigger, much more strategic question for every leader. How do we move from just protecting our existing glue people to proactively designing teams where that connective strength is built in and shared from the start? And I think this idea is about moving from being a firefighter to being an architect. and architecting our teams. It's about intentionally building a balanced team so crucial glue work doesn't default to one or two people, but does become a shared responsibility, like we talked about in our It's All the Work episode. When we build teams, we often focus exclusively on technical skills and experience, but all the research, decades of research that I've ever seen show, time and time again, that the most effective teams have a balance of behavioral roles. One way to think about this is ensuring you have a mix of three core tendencies on a team. The first one is action oriented people. These, you might think of these as doers. These are members who drive execution. They organize work, push for deadlines, and ensure things get finished. A lot of times they provide the momentum. Then there's the thought oriented people. We might call these the thinkers. These are your innovators and strategists. They bring new ideas, challenge assumptions, and analyze plans to make sure the team is pursuing the best possible path. If we say the doers provide momentum, then I would say the thinkers provide direction. And then I would say the third one is people-oriented people, and we might call these connectors. I think these people are natural enablers that we've been talking about in a lot of ways. They focus on cohesion, communication, and collaboration. They ensure the team works together smoothly, and they provide, you might say they provide the harmony for the teams. So I think as a leader, it's our job, and if you're listening, your job to audit your team's composition. Like Andy was saying before with the disc profile, if you have all of one, so if you have all doers, you're risking burnout and chaos. If you have all thinkers, you're risking analysis paralysis, where nothing ever ships. And if you have all connectors, you might have great morale, but it may be hard to execute on tough goals or even get things started and off the ground. So I think the real power of building a balanced team is that it distributes the emotional labor and coordination. Instead of relying on one stabilizer to keep meetings on track, a balanced team has members who can all play the role when needed. The goal isn't to hire one person who's good at communication, it's to create a team where clear communication is a non-negotiable shared standard. And I think this is the ultimate way to protect it. As we said earlier, you protect your glue people by not letting them be the only ones. You build a team where making assists is everyone's job. This requires a foundation of psychological safety, which you build by modeling it. So your thinkers feel safe to challenge, your doers, and everyone trusts connectors to help them navigate disagreements constructively. And I would say also, just something to add here is if you're not sure who the glue person or glue people are on your team, if you're not in a people manager position and you're part of a team and you go away for a week or a few days on vacation and come back and nothing has materially changed or moved, or there's no updates or no progress, there's a very good chance you might be the glue person for your team. So you may need to evaluate what you're doing, and if there's a way for you to help the rest of your team be more balanced so that when you are gone, they're not just sitting around waiting for you to get back to move things forward. But Andy, thinking about it from this team design perspective, is there any big mistakes you see leaders make when they're assembling a team? And do you have anything about your experience seeing truly well-balanced teams and how they operate differently than the imbalanced ones?
Yeah, I think you nailed it, right? Like with team composition, when I've seen it work well, there's variety, right? There's differences on the team, and I think that we should celebrate those differences, right? People don't necessarily look the same, don't necessarily come from the same background, don't come from the exact same setup, have different strengths and weaknesses, and that I think is how we end up with, the things being greater than some, right? Some of their parts. So I think it's really important to think about that, and I think it's also it's there are two other things I think are really, really worthwhile. One is realizing, as you had said, that we should be able to flip hats, right? We should be able to wear different roles across things. And as your career develops, you're going to wear different roles, you're going to do different sorts of things. And the other is that when you're building a team, you should also be trying to build a team with different levels of seniority within that team as well, right? Because what you bring to the table and your willingness to do different things is also going to vary based on seniority, right? Like you're going to have young, eager, like early career folks could be a huge asset, right? late career folks are a huge asset because they've usually synthesized everything and they're really good at connecting things, right? There's also like a tipping point of just like core technical competency that just like biologically erodes at a certain point, right? That doesn't mean that after 40 or whatever, people are no longer useful. It's think of it like the prime in your sports, right? Like you reach your prime somewhere in the middle of your career, you're at the height of your powers. You're still really useful and great at doing a whole bunch of other stuff as you know the some of those capabilities decline. And that's something I think leaders really need to think about is like if you have a super senior team, you probably want to bring in some more junior or more early career folks, right? And start working on building your team from the bottom up in that place, right? If you have a super young team, you probably want to bring in some experience to it, right? I think it's yeah. So that's how I like to think about it, and also be aware that like people can wear different hats, people can change, people can do different things, and just because somebody is great at doing glue work now or happy doing glue work now doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to be the person who wants to do that in the future. So be thoughtful about succession plans and understanding what everyone's doing and keeping the workload balanced across your team as well.
Awesome. That's where we're going to wrap up for today. If our last episode was about pushing back on the myth of the 10x individual, today was the flip side, revealing that assists and glue people are where teams truly win. We defined these invaluable contributors, explored why our systems are so often wired to miss them, and walked through the real costs from burnout to cultural decay when we let them stay invisible. We landed on a strategic approach, moving beyond just protecting individuals and toward intentionally building balanced teams where making each other better is a shared responsibility. So here's your challenge for this week, broken down into 3 small moves. First, in your next team meeting or update, name the assists out loud. Who set up a win for someone else? Who made a key introduction? Take 30 seconds to make that invisible work visible. Second, add one small piece of glue yourself. Write a clear decision note after a meeting, create a simple checklist for a recurring task, or find another small way to make the next handoff easier for the whole team. And third, run a quiet pulse check. Ask a few teammates privately who really helped you make progress this week. Look for the patterns, the names that don't always show up on the big reports, but show up consistently when you ask about it. And here's a final reflection to take with you. Who is the glue on your team, and what is one thing you will do this week to make their contribution more visible and sustainable? And if you are the glue, what is one boundary you could set to make that role healthier for yourself? Thanks for exploring leadership with us today on Leadership Explored. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode. What do you think about the glue people in your organization? Are they recognized and appreciated enough? Is there a glue person on your team you should thank this week? And have you ever been in that role? What did it feel like? And what can that experience teach you about making it better for others today? You can email us at leadershipexplored@gmail.com or connect with us on LinkedIn. We'd love to hear your stories or your ideas for topics you'd like us to explore in the future. If you found this conversation helpful, please make sure to follow the show, leave a review, or share it with someone who cares about growing great teams. Until next time, keep leading with purpose.